Hi, this is Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop. Thanks for joining me for this week's episode of the Sonic Scoop podcast. And this time, we're going to be talking about the two biggest mistakes that people usually make when it comes to setting levels. These are the last two things that a lot of people figure out when it comes to setting their mix balances. So let's get right into it. The quickest of shout outs to our sponsors before we get into it. Big thanks to SoundToys, some of my favorite makers of creative mixing effects. Try out anything they make for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com. Big thanks to those guys. Big thanks to Steinberg, makers of great DAWs like Nuendo and Cubase, as well as a super cool interface series, the UR series and the AXR series with some Rupert Neve designed preamps. Definitely check them out, steinberg.net. Last quick thing I need from you, if you're liking videos like this one, is to hit like and subscribe down below if you are on the YouTube version of this. Or if you want to get in touch with me and you're listening to the audio-only version, you can email me anytime, podcast@sonicscoop.com. All right, what are the two biggest mistakes that people make when it comes to setting balances in the mix? All right, I'm going to give you my vote. Number one is not automating. And this is a big thing I have to coach a lot of my mastering clients on if they're relatively new to mixing and looking for feedback. Or when I do coaching calls with some of my mix coaching clients, some of the feedback I often have to give. And it's one of the last things that people implement into their mixing strategy, but it really is that thing that adds that extra 15 to 20%, I think, of like mix quality, of getting serious about automating. And I'll give you some strategies about how to do that effectively and intelligently. And the other big problem that people, I think, run into, the other big mistake that they make is starting in the wrong place of the mix when they're setting their static levels. And I'll get into both of those in a little bit of detail. So number one, not automating. It is important to start your mix, I think, with just level balances. And when you're doing that, you don't need to start with automation necessarily. If there are a lot of problem tracks in the mix that you're working on, you may need to go in and do some automation in the beginning if there's really disparate changes on any given track. But you might start off by doing that with something like clip gain, where instead of riding a fader, you kind of go in and you say, obviously, this guitar is way too loud in the verse and way too quiet in the chorus. Maybe let me clip gain it so it's in a better place, and then we'll set a level balance from there. So those are the kinds of things that you can look for in your initial pass. But in an initial pass, I often recommend forget about automation, just find the right level. Then, after you've done your tweaking, and you're pretty far along in the mix and you've established your basic tones and your basic starting points, this is where automation becomes big. And this is where really the spirit and the soul and the heart of mixing are. If you have the ability, probably one of the best and most fun and intuitive ways to automate is to have some kind of motorized fader or set of motorized faders you can use. We recently did a mixing masterclass for MixCon with Michael Brower, amazing engineers, worked with Coldplay and Grizzly Bear and John Mayer and James Bay and all these people. And he always has this thing about, how the emotion in the mix comes from motion. And I love it because at the end of this masterclass, we just see him massaging things on his faders and hearing those changes happen in real time. He's doing his final automation pass on a real mix. And you can really hear how things improve, but also how they evolve and get better as the mix goes along and different things start to get highlighted a little bit and nothing ever pokes out too far unless we're trying to get it to poke out too far and draw our attention to it. And the mix becomes this like living, breathing organism because of that level of automation. And because it's being done by a living, breathing person in real time. It's not the only way to do automation. It's the way that Michael would definitely recommend, and I'd suggest at least trying if you've never done it. But a lot of people can do automation by writing squiggles on a screen and using, your bracket tool and your pencil tool and, using a fader and a mouse. It's totally possible. But this is the thing that again and again with new mixers, when I go to master the records, that'll come up, is that we don't have a totally consistent vocal level, or we don't have a totally consistent apparent vocal level because they're not riding the vocal. And it may very well be that as the mix gets denser and more elements get piled into it, your vocal may well need to come up in level. And this may need to happen within a single verse. It's not just having one level for the verse and one level for the chorus. It's also, as elements pile on, potentially bringing the vocal up. Or you don't want to over compress the vocal. So when we get to a quiet section, we might want to use our fader to bring the vocal up rather than just relying on compressing and limiting to do all of the work for us. I recommend this pass happening, though, after you do compression and limiting. And if you ever take my full-length course, Mixing Breakthroughs, which is like basically a whole system, a whole plan, a whole roadmap to get you through mixes successfully, intuitively, quickly, you'll see that it's plotted out kind of in this way, where my general recommendation, and this is the recommendation I found again and again from so many of the top mixers, is you start by setting your initial level balances. Then you go to your sweetening on a track-by-track basis. I recommend starting with EQ, and then after that compression, and then after that some of your effects. There are exceptions to this, and I could talk for a long time about what the exceptions would be and why I'd recommend you break from this general template. All that's in the course and all that, but I'll try to give you as much detail as I can without making this one super long. But that's the general idea. And once that stuff is done, you've done your basic level setting, basic EQing, compression, reverb setting. Now I'd recommend that this is the stage for doing that final pass of automation. But now I need to back up a little bit to talk about the other big mistake that people leave out early on. So one of the big things I find, they don't start automating very early on to their mixing. And at a certain point, they figure out they've got to do it. The other major thing to look at is where you're starting to get your initial level balances. And this is super important to help you mix quickly and efficiently. The lazy thing to do, just like a lazy thing to do would be not automate, I got a good static mix, I'm done. The lazy thing to do is just start your mix at the beginning. But this is often a problem and often the worst place to start your mix. Because the intros to songs are usually fairly sparse, right? It's rare that you hear a song production and all the elements that are ever going to be happen there from moment one, and then things are less dense afterwards. That's unusual. Does it happen? Can it happen? Yeah. Is it the normal thing? No. Usually we start with some of the elements, right? Maybe it's just an acoustic guitar or, an acoustic guitar and a vocal, or maybe it's just this lush pad and then the drums drop. Then the vocal comes in. Then the other elements of the drum kit comes in. Then the other instruments come in. And then as we get further along, maybe that intro section or verse, maybe the chorus hits. And now even more elements are coming in. Maybe the background vocals. Maybe there's a piano being added. You get the idea. The problem is if you start in this sparse intro section that just has an acoustic guitar and a vocal, and you try to make each of them sound as big and as beautiful as you can, then when the drums drop and the bass drops, there's no room for them. When the other guitar drops or the other keyboard drops, there's no space for them. And now you're trying to cram things in. What if instead you started in one of your most dense and most important sections, maybe the second chorus of the song, and started piecing the puzzle together there? So you don't have this situation where you've painted yourself into a corner and now there's so much more work to be done. Where do I fit these things in? Instead, you start in the most dense and possibly most important section, and then start there with your most important elements and fit everything in around them. And then maybe you can back up and go to the more sparse sections. And that's a much easier, more intuitive, more fun, more fruitful way to mix, I find, than the opposite. And you may find here that you start doing a little bit of automation, what I would consider maybe macro automation, where for your choruses, you've set a certain level for your guitar, your vocal, your snare drum, all of that. And as you back up to the verse before it that doesn't have as many elements in it, maybe those relationships change a little bit. Maybe here the guitar actually wants to come up because it's one of the only elements in the verse, and it can come up in level compared to where it was in the chorus. Well, meanwhile, maybe the vocal can come down because it doesn't need to be as loud to be the most dominant thing in the mix. It can be a little quieter and still be the most dominant thing in the mix in the verse compared to the chorus. So you might do that kind of macro automation where you do your sectional automation. And then once all of that stuff is done, once all of your sweetening is done, that's where you do your final pass, where you're doing your last little bit of level writing, whether you're writing it on the screen or doing your faders. So you get your static mix, you get a good static mix in a section where it's harder to do that, and then you back up to your other sections, tweak where you need to. You might not need to do that much tweaking if you start in the most dense section. And then after that, you're looking for the final passive automation, where it's like, hey, in this bridge from the verse into the chorus, the vocal needs to come up a little bit, or hey, here in the verse, the hi-hats can come down, that kind of thing. And if you start integrating these two ideas into your mixing practice, your mixing strategy, I think you're going to improve dramatically. I think it's going to give you much better results than you've had before. And I think you're going to get, in a lot of ways, that additional 10 or 15 or 20% that you think you're missing just by making these two small adjustments. All right, I hope this one has been useful for you. If you want more great stuff like this, of course, I do have the full-length course, Mixing Breakthroughs, but I want to give you some free stuff. There is the 5 Habits of Truly Great Mixers that you can get totally for free, 40-minute workshop with me, all about the common threads between the greatest mixers out there working today. You can check that out at sonicscoop.com/mixhabits. That's sonicscoop.com/mixhabits. This has been Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop. Big shout out again to our sponsors, which include you. How do you sponsor this podcast? By smashing the like button or giving us a 5-star rating and review if you're listening to an audio version of this podcast, and by giving me comments down below. When did you start automating? Was it early on in your career, or did it take you a while? When did you start shifting, or have you started shifting to this idea of not starting your mixes at the beginning? Has that been helpful for you? Have you tried it? If you do try it, let me know how it works out for you in the comments down below. Our other big sponsors, Sound Toys. Big thanks to those guys. Try out anything they make for free for 30 days over at soundtoys.com. Some of my favorite creative mixing effects in the known universe. And also Steinberg, makers of not only great DAWs like Cubase and Nuendo, which are super duper powerful, but also a range of awesome interfaces, including their U series and their AXR series that have those built-in Rupert Neve designed preamps and give you a ton of connectivity. So definitely check them out. This has been Justin Colletti of Sonic Scoop. Thanks for hanging out with me. Happy mixing. See you next time.